We're turning the page tonight to 2015, a year that holds the promise, as Mario Cuomo once said, of politics as poetry and governing as prose. That's tonight on Washington Week. The promise of a blank page. Can the president use the new year to restore his popularity and complete an unfinished agenda?
Now you've got Republicans in a position where it's not enough for them simply to grind the wheels of Congress to a halt and then blame me.
Will the new Republican Congress replace his plans with their own? Could the Supreme Court change course with critical rulings on health care and gay marriage? And who will emerge in the best position to win the 2016 presidential nomination? Old names or new? Here with a preview of the news we'll be watching this year, Molly Ball, political correspondent for The Atlantic, Joan Biskupic, legal affairs editor for Reuters, Ed O'Keefe, congressional correspondent for The Washington Post, and Alexis Simendinger, White House correspondent for Real Clear Politics.
Award-winning reporting and analysis, covering history as it happens. Live from our nation's capital, this is Washington Week with Gwen Ifill. Once again, live from Washington, moderator Gwen Ifill.
Good evening. Tonight we bring you a handy guide to what to watch for this year in the three branches of government, and as we gear up to cover another potentially historic presidential campaign. First, to the White House, where polling from CNN shows the president's job approval rating is at its highest point in nearly a year, but still under 50%, at 48%. The president seems to sense this as well, telling NPR's Steve Inskeep that the rebounding economy has helped.
What is true is that I'm in a position now where, with the economy relatively strong, with us having lowered the deficit, with us having strong growth and job growth, for the first time us starting to see wages ticking up, with inflation low, with energy production high. Now I have the ability to focus on some long-term projects, including making sure that everybody is benefiting from this growth and not just some.
Alexis, long-term projects, the president's for term, what is he talking about, and does he have the leverage to get any of it done?
It's a great question. The president, as you could tell from the tone of his voice, it's a real mix of resignation and that sort of reservoir of ambition that he still has to fill the last 2 years.
Right.
So it's a mix of, I'm going to go through my checklist of unfinished business, I'm playing for history. He's talking more about legacy, trying to finish up the unfinished business. What he has leverage to do is really going to be interesting, and I'm going to be interested what Ed has to say about this, because he has never been in this terrain playing with Republican-dominated House and Senate. So this is all new to him. He's going to have to be a broker, a horse trader. He's going to have to be working from a position of somewhat weakness with his own party, and he has not necessarily been that great at doing that up to this point.
I was struck by the juxtaposition of ambition and resignation.
Yes.
I don't know how those two things coexist.
In Barack Obama, they exist very naturally, actually. So what I mean by that is his resignation is he understands the terrain is different. He understands what he has not been able to do effectively. But the ambition is, look, the economy is getting better. I still have some traction on some of these issues. Tax reform. He thinks that Republicans want to work with him on tax reform. He thinks that on the idea of trade, that Republicans want to work with him on trade. He thinks on the international terrain that he and the United States still has this, the indispensable nation, that the engagement that he started is what he's going to carry through on. So he is a man with still lingering ambition.
Well, Alexis, how will that play out? Let's just take trade and taxes, for example. What kinds of proposals do you think could possibly bring some compromise?
So tax reform, we're talking about corporate tax reform, which is very interesting. The president, before Christmas time, did talk to Mitch McConnell, the incoming Senate Majority Leader. They talked about how they might be able to trade proposals, actual concrete ideas. It from all the folks that I've talked to who have also been Democratic advisors to President Obama, this is much harder when you get down to the brass tacks than just talking about the idea that Republicans and Democrats want to come together. And the president has this idea that he can leverage some of his pet projects, which would be infrastructure spending, roads and bridges. Let's use some extra revenue for Democratic ideas and find some partners, and that the business community wants to do that. On trade, he's ready to defy some of the Democrats in his party on this. And I'm old enough to have covered the NAFTA fight during the Clinton years, and I remember how tough that is with your fellow Democrats. And they're already laying some tough markers on whether, first of all, he has to negotiate that with 11 nations, and then you have to go to the Senate and get them to okay that.
Alexis, the president has been burned so many times before when he thought he was getting good signals from Republicans, could work with them on things like entitlement reform or the fiscal grand bargain. Why does he think this time is different? Does he have a new strategy? Is there something that leads him to believe it can be different?
One of the things that interests me about Barack Obama is he looks at the landscape and he tries to figure out, he thinks he's got this idea of whose political interests are going to fit in with his political interests. In the tax reform, he thinks Mitch McConnell, for instance, has 2 years, and that Republicans want to show that they can govern. He thinks that is an incentive for them to work and develop some sort of ideas. If Mitch McConnell wants to show for 2 years of his leadership facing a tougher calendar in 2016 for Republican senators, wants to hold that majority, he thinks maybe they can work with that and use that and work across the aisle. But it is truly a good question because the devil's in the details, and we haven't seen a whole lot of evidence of it.
Real quick, are there any other executive actions or memos or orders up his sleeve that are going to infuriate
We saw what he did
Republicans?
with Guantanamo this week.
Right.
So on Guantanamo, unfinished business and something the president definitely wants to complete as near as he can before handing it off to a successor. He's got 127 detainees left and still moving them out. We saw today the president had executive action on sanctioning North Korea. So we're going to see the president continue to use his executive power where he can.
Okay, well, next to Congress, as Alexis was mentioning, their leaders there are preparing to create an agenda of their own. So let's go back and look at the polls. CNN ORC asked an interesting question. Do you think the policies being proposed by Republican leaders in Congress will move the country in the right direction or the wrong direction? 43% said the right direction, 49% said the wrong direction. But what policies are we talking about, and who are those pollsters talking to, Ed?
Well, they're going to start with an easy one, with the authorization of the Keystone XL pipeline, this lingering issue, which really isn't that big a deal policy-wise, but politically certainly has become quite a very big concern. There's a lot of Democratic support for this, so Republicans eager to get it done in both chambers very quickly and send it to the president and remind him, look, dozens of Democrats agree with us. Why would you ever stand in the way of this? But he's expected probably to do so. From there, at least in the Senate, they're going to move on to another issue with big bipartisan support, stronger sanctions on Iran. This is something that the White House asked Senate Democrats to hold off on last year as the talks with Tehran continued. Now, Democrats and Republicans want to move on it, and that very well could be an early issue as well. Bottom line, they want to do something, and they want to make Americans like the Republican Party ahead of the 2016 presidential elections.
Don't Democrats, even though they're now the minority, want to do something too?
Some of them do. You got to look at the sort of the guys in the middle who will become instant power brokers, guys like Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota, and others who have said for years we're very eager to make deals. That's the whole reason they came to the Senate in the first place. Well, now is their chance. Bob Corker, Republican of Tennessee, was talking to him today. He's been in the minority his entire Senate career, and he said, I have told the Democrats, now is your moment. Now you will become relevant because you are now in a position to help cut deals and get things to 60 votes that can prevail. So they'll turn to people like Mark Warner and Tim Kaine of Virginia and other moderates who are probably willing and certainly able to cut deals with them.
Well, you know, that sounds like something for the Senate in terms of bipartisanship, but what about the House? Don't we have like a record number of Republicans now, like more than we've had in, 7 decades or something like that?
247, which is the most since the 1928 election. So they're
So
excited.
can Republicans work with other Republicans?
That is, well, that's a big question, and that's partly why the first few months of the House calendar, at least, are going to look a lot like the last few years, because they're going to very quickly now push through some of the bills that passed that sat on Harry Reid's desk. How many times did did we hear that over the course of the campaign? Because now they'll clear Mitch McConnell's desk and probably get sent on their way to the president, who will either veto them or perhaps sign them and actually find some ways to cut some deals.
Ed, I was listening to the president talk about how he's going to use his veto pen much more than he has. We know he's done it twice before in the years he's been president, and he is expecting to use it more forcefully. In that early rush of the Republican leadership sending bills for the president to veto, how do they anticipate that that's going to be perceived by the public? Is that for their base only, or is that a demonstration of governing?
I think it's both. The first test will come by February 27th. Remember that they passed 11 of the 12 spending bills through the end of the fiscal year, but funding for Homeland Security expires at the end of February. Republicans salivating at the opportunity to finally now take a legislative response to what the president did. There, already you've seen the White House, talk about the fact that they think it's weird that Republicans want to hold up funding for airport security and port security and other elements of Homeland Security over some executive actions that the president took. So that'll be an early test. Later on, it'll be issues with the budget and appropriations bills, certainly an ability for them to draw contrast. And you're right, it'll be a question of, well, do we really want to hold up the government over something so insignificant in the grand scheme, or do we want to make the political point?
Well, and what about the Democratic leadership? I mean, Republicans just won a big election. They arguably have a mandate. But now, after the Republicans have been blocking so much for so long, don't the Democrats want, at least some of them, to sort of give the Republicans a taste of their own medicine, given that Republicans are going to need Democratic votes for some of this stuff, and Democrats have an opportunity to say, well, it's tough, you didn't give us what we wanted back then?
That's the big question that Democrats haven't answered. You talk to them about what they want to do. They talk again about income inequality, relieving student loan debt, immigration reform, women's rights, things that they ran on and have been prioritizing for the last several years, and you wonder, well, is that going to work given the new environment? Again, I think because so many are going to side with Republicans on a lot of this, it could be very difficult for Harry Reid, but inevitably there will be differences, and we'll see whether or not they're willing to block it.
Can I ask you briefly about the House Republicans? We saw this week the dust up about Steve Scalise, the third-ranking Republican in the House, who 12 years ago, according to his story, unwittingly spoke before a group of racists in Louisiana. He survives?
For now. If there's more evidence of something else, some other speech, or perhaps video of this surfaces, or there's evidence of him consorting with David Duke and other white supremacists in Louisiana a little more often, that will be a problem. Top Republican leadership aides admit that. But for now, he holds on to the job. They move very quickly and decisively on this, and Republicans have gone to great lengths to point out, when it comes to scandal, John Boehner moves fast. Michael Grimm, the tax-cheating Staten Island Republican, he's gone. Remember Trey Radel, the one who got caught up with drugs last year, was gone very quickly. Chris Lee, a Republican from New York, also was gone very fast. They say that's an interesting contrast with Democrats who have allowed several members with lapses to stick around.
Well, it helps to be convicted of something, I think.
It does.
It's a lot easier, clearer to move on it when someone's actually been convicted as opposed to just under a cloud. But we'll see what happens with Scalise. But with only 3 or 4 major rulings, the real key is going to be at the Supreme Court, which could render a lot of White House and congressional priorities moot, whether it's the future of the president's signature Affordable Care Act or the prospect of rolling back laws in dozens of states that now permit same-sex marriage. This promises to be a consequential year. What tops the docket, Joan?
Yes, in some ways it's a sequel to what we've seen before, because I'll start with, we have our best 2 cases involve Obamacare and then same-sex marriage, which the justices are going to say in just about a week whether they're going to take up again. Start with the Obama-sponsored health care law from 2010. It's back under another challenge. This one, a much more practical challenge to the core provision that says that there will be federal tax credits to people who buy health insurance on exchanges. The law itself actually refers to state exchanges. So the question is, can people who buy insurance through federally facilitated exchanges, which is the majority now, can they also get these tax credits? The Obama administration argues they should be able to do this. The IRS has interpreted this law as written to extend to all exchanges, whether they're run by the states or the federal government has stepped in. The challengers say, hey, we're looking at the clear language of it, and it does not allow these tax credits for exchanges set up by the federal government.
And
It's a core part of the whole thing. In fact, if you all remember from 2012 when we had the constitutional challenge, it was a broad-based challenge. It was something that went to the heart of the individual mandate. But this actually goes to the practicalities. And as one dissenting judge in one of the cases below said, it could gut everything if the Supreme Court ends up ruling that it would only allow tax credits for state exchange.
Joan, the administration has been really touting in the second year of enrollment what a high percentage, that's like 87% of those who are enrolling or re-enrolling are getting the subsidies. Are they playing to a particular member on the court? Who's likely on the court to have a decisive decision-making power here?
Well, last time it was 5-4, with the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, casting the deciding vote, kind of defying conventional wisdom that it would be Anthony Kennedy, our usual decider, but it was the chief who switched over and voted with the 4 liberal members of the court to uphold Obamacare. This time, it's a closer call. As Gwen remembers, we predicted that, and I actually thought that the chief would switch that time. This time, I think it's harder because it's a statutory case, and in some ways, the more conservative members can say, well, Congress, if we say that this applies only to states, you can fix it. You can rewrite it. As we know, Congress is not going to rewrite anything having to do with Obamacare at this point. I still think it could fall to the chief. And he's, speaking of somebody who's concerned about his legacy, John Roberts is concerned about his legacy. This would be a major, major move if the Roberts court struck down this key portion of the Obama law.
And what about on same-sex marriage? You know, they previously in this term declined to take some of the challenges to same-sex marriage that were coming out of the states. Do we think that there's going to be a case they can take up now?
The advocates had let out breathed a sigh of relief. They thought they were over their hump, but now...
No. Okay, this is where we were in October. Five states had there were cases from 5 states saying, you know, come and decide once and for all whether there's a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. The Supreme Court surprised many of us by saying, we're not coming into it right now. But this is what's changed since then. There were 19 states that allowed same-sex marriage back in October. Now we have 36, if you count Florida, which starting next week is going to allow it. We also didn't have a split among lower appeals courts on this. The appeals courts that had been ruling on same-sex marriage had all said that there should be a constitutional right. Now we actually have a ruling from the Midwest, from the Sixth Circuit, covering Ohio, Michigan, Kentucky, and Tennessee, saying those people are not entitled to a right to same-sex marriage. I think it really does force the Supreme Court's hand this time. And as I said, the earliest they might tell us would be January 9th.
Real quick,
Sure.
One of the things we always wonder about the court is how's everyone doing and who might be hanging it up anytime soon?
Well, there was a lot of pressure on Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's our eldest justice at 81, to step down just in case the Republicans took the Senate, which they did, and just in case something could happen that would make it harder for President Obama to replace her, or we have a new president in 2016, a Republican. But she's healthy. She's hanging in there. She gets regular cancer checks. She has survived 2 serious bouts with cancer. Our next eldest justices are Anthony Kennedy and Antonin Scalia, both 78, and they don't look to be going anywhere soon.
Okay. Well, that's a part of your job, that the Ghoul Watch.
Oh, yeah, completely.
Who might retire. And finally, everything that happens and doesn't happen this year will inevitably play out against the background of the next presidential campaign. Just this week, Jeb Bush resigned from all of the boards he served on, presumably clearing the decks for a run. Hillary Clinton remains the major Democratic contender, but at least a half a dozen others are lining up on the chance that lightning will strike and they can displace the frontrunners. Against this backdrop, consider the CNBC economic survey showing that 53% of Americans are pessimistic about the current and future economic situation, while only 23% are optimistic. So who's best positioned to win that fight right now? The people we know who are thinking about this model.
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think what we're hearing is that as these candidates start to hone their messages, start to come up with a sort of reason for running, they are all going to have to answer that question. They are all going to have to figure out how to speak to those Americans who, no matter how much we talk about the Dow going up and the rate of growth in the economy, obviously a lot of people still are deeply pessimistic. And so, you know, it's a very unsettled field right now. As much as people think, oh, we just finished an election. Why do we have to hear about this now? This is actually the most interesting.
It's 2015 now. It's okay.
It's okay now as of New Year's.
It's now
This is really the most interesting part of the whole cycle, right? As people look around and talk to their donors and try to make their decisions and try to gauge the electorate. And a candidate who was looking at this race, someone like a Rick Perry, is going to be taking the temperature as he sees it of what is it that voters are looking for this year, and do I have something that speaks to that? So I think, we've got on the Democratic side, it's a one-person race. And on the Republican side, it's like a 12-way tie. It's just crazy. And so, I've got my whole list of candidates right here on the Republican side. There's just so many. But I think the top tier right now is Jeb, who you mentioned, who it's almost like he's a professional. It's almost like he knows someone who's done this before.
Yeah, perhaps.
The way he's making these moves, coming out, first announcing the exploratory committee and disencumbering himself of these entanglements, these professional entanglements. But also, I think he knows that not being in elected office, he doesn't have the same platform that a lot of these other guys have. So he has to inject himself into the conversation. He's doing that very effectively. I think Chris Christie is still in that top tier. I think Rand Paul, Ted Cruz looks like he is also going to make a bid for that sort of the lane that Paul is sort of in, which is the sort of conservative anti-establishment lane. You've got a couple of social conservatives, Rick Santorum saying he might run again, Mike Huckabee, Marco Rubio. It's not clear what lane he's in, and I think that's become a problem for him, and also Jeb crowding the Florida donor field. And then a lot of other guys, a lot of those governors, Bobby Jindal, Scott Walker, John Kasich, Mike Pence.
Everybody in the pool.
Well, let me ask you.
Really, it's anybody's game on the Republican side.
With all that has developed with Jeb Bush just in the last week or so, have you been able to detect Hillary Clinton acting differently because of his moves? What should we be watching for on that?
I really think that Jeb has sort of thrown down a gauntlet, and the Hillary world is going to start feeling the pressure as well. She's been scheduling speaking engagements several months down the road, which has led people to say, okay, she's looking for a late start. But at some point, donors are going to get antsy. People on the Democratic side, especially if Republicans start even more openly declaring their intentions, all these Republicans are running against Hillary already. And at some point, it becomes incumbent on her to respond and to be an actual rather than just sort of a spectral presence in the race.
Time for one more quick question and answer.
I guess, you look at that list that you have there. If there was someone at the bottom of the pack who you thought had a chance to jump up towards the top, who might it be at this point?
I think the sleeper candidate to keep an eye on is Ben Carson, who is not a politician, but who is a doctor and really beloved by the conservative base, and who has a super PAC that's been out there creating space for him that has raised more money than the Ready for Hillary super PAC. So there are a lot of the sort of talk radio crowd, the Tea Party crowd, looking for a standard bearer. A lot of these guys whose names I've been reading, they're all elected officials. That doesn't count. And so someone like Ben Carson, who has some unorthodox views, could surprise even some people who think they support him.
Okay,
but there could be room in the field.
Thank you. But before we go tonight, we have to cut it a little short because we'd like to send our condolences to the family of former New York Governor Mario Cuomo, one of the nation's larger-than-life public servants. Our remembrance comes by way of a forthcoming PBS documentary, The Italian Americans, airing next month. In this excerpt, the story of the speech that vaulted Cuomo onto the national stage.
At the 1984 Democratic National Convention, Cuomo delivered a keynote address that catapulted him into the national spotlight and marked him as the next great hope of the Democratic Party.
Please allow me to skip the stories and the poetry and the temptation to deal in nice but vague rhetoric.
I was in the hall when that speech was being made, and usually in the conventions, when there are people speaking at the podium, people are walking around and talking and not paying attention.
That they helped lift up generations to the middle class and higher.
Little by little, as he continued to speak, the crowd got quieter and quieter and quieter.
And before that, to reach heights that our own parents would not have dared dream of.
Until, all of a sudden, everybody was sitting down and listening to the speech.
I learned about our kind of democracy from my father, and I learned about our obligation to each other from him and my mother. They were able to build a family and live in dignity and see one of their children go from behind their little grocery store in South Jamaica on the other side of the tracks where he was born to occupy the highest seat in the greatest state, in the greatest nation, in the only world we know.
It was compassionate, it was pragmatic, it took pride in his Italian-American heritage. I think that remains one of the top 10 speeches in history.
Yesterday, at the age of 82. We'll talk about Cuomo a little more on the Washington Week webcast extra. You can find it at pbs.org/Washington Week later tonight and all week long. Also, keep up with daily developments with me and Judy Woodruff on the PBS NewsHour, and we'll see you here next week on Washington Week. Good night.